and welcome to our first foray into Facebook Live. I'm here with the leadership team of Evidence for Action. So we'll just quickly introduce ourselves. I'm Erin Hagan, the Deputy Director.
I'm Nancy Adler, the Director.
And David Vlahov, I'm the Co-Director.
And I'm Maria Gleamore, I'm the Associate Director.
Laura Gottlieb, the other Associate Director.
And you should introduce yourselves.
I'm Christine holding the iPad.
I'm Stephanie off camera. Hi, I'm the Communications Assistant for Evidence for Action.
Great. So we're excited to be here having this little chat this morning with you. Anyone who happens to be joining us. We have recently re-released our call for proposals and have hosted a webinar to tell people about the changes, which are relatively minimal. And we got so many questions on that webinar that we weren't able to respond to them all. So we thought we would take a minute this morning and respond to a couple of the very high-level important questions that we weren't able to get to. And also just give you a little bit of sense of who the leadership is, why we enjoy being involved in this program and find our work important, and if people are participating, we're happy to answer your live questions as well. So let's just jump right in. Why don't we start by talking about what has been either the most fulfilling or most unexpected or surprising aspect of being part of Evidence for Action so far? Nancy, you want to start?
Okay, I'll start. The most surprising and fulfilling has been the incredible interest in the program. We've gotten over 600 letters of intent. We've had, I think now, it's safe to say thousands of people listen to the webinars, and also the really interesting projects that are going on all around the country that are represented in those letters of intent.
Yeah, absolutely. David, how about you?
Yeah, for me, it's also been the wide range of topical areas, housing, food insecurity, financial insecurity, prison reform, guns, immigration. I mean, the list goes on. And if we had tried to be prescriptive in our proposal, in our announcement, I don't think we could have gotten the variety on these important issues. And so I think that was a little bit unexpected, but absolutely delightful in terms of what we're seeing.
Laura, how about you?
You know, I agree. I think that all of those have been super rewarding. I think another piece that I really enjoyed about this process has been this sort of incredible range of people that we've been able to interact with through this process. So our applicants for sure, and then in addition to our applicants, the National Program Office at RWJ, the other National Program Officers for Systems and Policies for Action, and others. I feel like the richness of those conversations has been really special, and I have learned a ton.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Maria?
I would definitely agree with the idea that the diversity of projects has been fascinating, and especially the really innovative ways that people have of thinking about inequalities and disparities. I think that there have been a lot of approaches I would not have anticipated, and asking really important questions about how health inequalities play out and how we can help to impact them. Also, every time that we have a grantee, we have a meeting right after we sort of the award starts, and that has been really fun because people just always have fantastic research going on. It's really wonderful to talk with everyone.
Yeah, you know, on that point for me, I just have been so impressed by how engaged our grantees have been, how willing they've been to think outside the box around their dissemination strategies, to really take to heart the action piece of Evidence for Action. So that's been really rewarding and fulfilling for me as well. So that's a great sort of place for us to start to reflect on the program, and I want to get to a couple of the questions that we received from people, which will also allow us to talk in a little more depth about some of the grantees that we have. So people frequently ask us what are the health outcomes that people are measuring, because that is a requirement of Evidence for Action, that the project be looking at health outcomes, and people are wondering exactly what we define as a health outcome or what we would allow as a health outcome. So why don't we, maybe each of you can take a project and talk a little bit, give a quick, maybe a sentence or two about what that project's about, and then talk about the health outcomes that are being measured. And keeping in mind that in some cases, these projects are also measuring other sort of non-health or more social determinant outcomes as well, but to focus a little bit on the health outcomes. So let me turn to you again, Nancy, if I can. This is the benefit of both being a director and sitting on my left. And maybe you can talk about the worksite wellness project that we recently awarded, because I know there was an interest, you had an interest in a part of their research design.
And so this is testing the impact of a worksite wellness program. There was a randomized trial. This was an add-on. The Evidence for Action support was an add-on to an NIH-funded project that allowed them to look at some of the finer issues. And the one that I was most interested in was that they were able to look at, they're going to be able to look at self-selection of who takes advantage of wellness programs and the impact of that on who's participating in peer effects. And they had a wide range of outcomes that they were going to look at. So they were going to use self-rated health data, administrative data, and also they were going to collect biometric data, including waist-hip ratio, blood pressure, blood glucose, and blood lipid levels. So this is probably one of the most complete set of health outcomes. Most projects don't have that quite that range.
Yeah, and I think it's relevant to note that they do have this other NIH funding that sort of, ours is a smaller supplement, and so because sometimes, especially biometric data, can be expensive to collect. So Laura, why don't you talk about, people often ask us what designs are appropriate and whether or not we would accept qualitative research, and so we do, and so maybe you could talk about that study just a little bit.
Sure. So one of the earliest grants that we made was to a group that is actually looking at some of the unintended consequences of a lawsuit that has been filed against almost 40 school districts in the state of California. California passed legislation for minimum physical activity requirements in schools, and some schools have not been able to meet those requirements. A lawsuit was filed against those school districts, and this is the only purely qualitative study that we have funded so far, but their approach to looking at what the consequences of that strategy for forcing compliance would be is really interesting and creative. Their health outcomes include the amount of physical activity that is underway in the schools that they'll be looking at. They're also looking at attitudes and behaviors of school personnel around physical activity. But it's an exciting project. I'm really interested in what they're going to find out.
Yeah, absolutely. Another sort of interesting, Maria, study that has a wide range of health outcomes, but we're not actually going to see those the longer term outcomes right away, which people frequently ask us too, when there's policy change or when there's a programmatic shift, sometimes you don't see health outcomes right away. So what are we supposed to do about measuring health outcomes? So I think the Seattle Yesler Terrace project is a good example, if you want to maybe talk about that a little bit.
So Yesler Terrace is a publicly subsidized housing development in Seattle, and this project really addresses a very important question about how investments in improving the quality of public housing in the context in which people are living improves their health. And but one of the challenges that they face is that really it's going to take much longer. The overall project is much longer than our grant period, and so they had to define some interim outcomes that would be compelling about the interim evidence on the effects of the project. And I think that one of the themes that we've seen in many projects is that in order to really have rigorous designs, people are often linking data sources and using multiple data sources to address sort of complementary solutions to design issues. And so they're using data both from linkage with Medicaid records on sort of diagnostic issues, also health service utilization information on preventable hospitalizations, for example, and they're able to sort of disentangle usage from actual indicators of better health. And then also measures such as self-rated health and depression status that you wouldn't necessarily find in a medical record. And that's a great sort of combination of multiple indicators.
Absolutely. So, David, if you maybe want to talk about the gun violence study that we recently funded, I think also an example of some interesting data linkages that are going on.
So the gun violence project has a team that is really putting together a new framework to look at firearm violence in the context of culture of violence, culture of guns is what they're looking at. And as part of that project, they're looking at how to define gun culture and then how to measure and analyze it, a culture in terms of firearm policy. And one of the things that they're doing in that is looking at adding to a multi-state level data set in terms of looking at gun ownership, looking at firearm policy, and looking at firearm-related deaths, and looking at the interaction of those as they relate to gun culture. And so I think this is really innovative in what they're bringing to us.
Absolutely. So on this topic of outcomes, you know, we've been hearing the foundation talk quite a bit more recently about well-being as an outcome. We've been know that there's a lot of work going on in that field, and so as we have started to incorporate well-being more into our framework, people have started to ask us, what do we mean by well-being? How do we envision that being included in a proposal to measure outcomes? So Nancy, maybe you could talk a little bit about how we're envisioning well-being in the context of our program and applications.
Sure. Well, first of all, well-being is so important. It's really what people are seeking with good health. And we've struggled with the measurement because there isn't a gold standard measure for it. We certainly look for innovative ways that people are defining it and measuring it. And this is one area where we would consider supporting some targeted measure development. But what we're really encouraging people to do is include measures of well-being along with other population health measures so that we can look at the relationships between well-being and other aspects that also should contribute to well-being.
Great, absolutely. So I know that we're getting close on time. Why don't we take one more question from our webinar queue. On this point of developing measures, actually, we frequently get questions about, is the development of key measures or instruments to evaluate health and well-being of particular interest? So David, could you speak to that?
Yeah, we are interested in the development of new measures. And, you know, for example, we're looking at, interested in measures of population health or health equity. So that's measures or indicators. And we're also looking at those that might put together a connection between social determinants of health and traditional measures. Should say what we're not interested in, what we will not fund, is development or validation of measures of specific diseases or risk factors. But we are interested in measurement of health outcomes overall.
Yeah, outcome measures versus tools or screeners or that sort of thing, which we have seen in the past. So I know we've kind of met our time that we had originally allotted for this conversation. We appreciate anyone who may have joined or may view this in the future. I do want to encourage you, if you happen to be viewing this at any point in time, to check out our frequently asked questions